You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In the United States, there's a unique system called the Electoral College that comes into play every 4 years to select the president and vice president. This process is spelled out in the United States Constitution, specifically in Article 2. Essentially, each state gets a number of electoral votes that equals its total number of senators and representatives in Congress. The states have the authority, based on their own laws, to decide how to pick these electors. However, current federal office holders can't serve as electors. Thanks to the 23rd Amendment, Washington, D.C. also gets 3 electoral votes, making the total number of electors 538. To win the presidency, a candidate needs a majority of these votes, at least 270. If no one gets a majority, the decision moves to Congress, with the House choosing the president and the Senate choosing the vice president. On Election Day in November, Americans vote not directly for their preferred presidential candidate, but for electors who've pledged to vote for that candidate or ticket. Most states have a winner-takes-all approach, sending all their electors to the candidate who wins the state. Maine and Nebraska do things a bit differently, dividing their electors between congressional district winners and the overall state winner. These electors then officially cast their votes in December, and the president and vice president are inaugurated in January. Debate about the Electoral College has been around since it was created in 1787. Some people think it's a good system because it forces presidential candidates to appeal to voters across the entire country. Others feel it doesn't fairly represent the actual vote totals from across the nation. They point out issues like unequal voting power across states, the possibility of electors not voting as promised, known as faithless electors, and the outsized influence of swing states. Actually, there have been more attempts to change the Electoral College system than any other part of the Constitution, with a significant push for reform in 1969 to 1970. Critics especially argue that the system can lead to situations where the candidate who wins the national popular vote doesn't become president, which has happened several times, including in elections like those in 2000 and in 2016. Unlike the United States, other democracies have moved away from such systems in favor of direct elections for their leaders. The U.S. Constitution, specifically in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, spells out how states should select their electors for the presidential election. Each state is given a number of electors equal to its number of Congress members. That's representatives plus 2 senators. The Constitution also says it's up to the states to decide how these electors are chosen. But it makes one thing clear: you can't be an elector if you hold a federal office. When it's time for the presidential election, which takes place on the Tuesday after the first Monday of November, states and the District of Columbia pick their electors based on their own rules. After the votes are counted, each state prepares a certificate of ascertainment to list out who their electors are. These electors then gather in their respective states or the District of Columbia to officially vote for president, the outcome of which is documented in a certificate of vote and sent to Congress. In most states, the rule is that whichever presidential candidate wins the majority of the state's popular vote gets all the electoral votes from that state. However, Maine and Nebraska do things a bit differently. They distribute 2 electoral votes to the statewide winner and then 1 each to the winner in each of their congressional districts. Washington, D.C. also participates by assigning its 3 electoral votes to the winner of its district vote. States usually make their electors promise to vote for the candidates who won in their state to avoid any surprises, and there are laws in place to enforce this. The electors meet to cast their votes in their state capitals on the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday in December, which falls between December 14th and 20th. Their votes are then counted in Congress in early January, in a joint session of the Senate and the House of Representatives led by the Vice President. If no candidate wins a majority, the election isn't over. The House of Representatives selects the president, with each state getting 1 vote, and the Senate picks the vice president, with each senator casting a vote. The winners are inaugurated on January 20th. Since 1964, the Electoral College has included 538 electors, with 535 coming from the states, reflecting the total number of Congress members, and an additional 3 electors representing Washington, D.C., thanks to the 23rd Amendment ratified in 1961. This gives D.C. the same amount of electors as the least populous state. As the Constitutional Convention was winding down, The delegates settled on creating the Electoral College as the method to elect the president. This decision was influenced heavily by slave states, which favored the Electoral College because it allowed them to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for determining their number of electoral votes, and by smaller states, which gained power through a guaranteed minimum of 3 electors. Despite exploring other options like a direct election proposed by figures like Hamilton, the Electoral College was chosen as the best compromise after everything else was turned down. According to Levitsky and Ziblatt, this wasn't the result of some grand design or theory. It was more of a fallback plan when no other method could get enough support. In 1787, discussions at the convention largely revolved around the Virginia Plan's suggestion for Congress to elect the president, a proposal initially agreed upon by most states. However, concerns over violating the separation of powers led to the idea being abandoned. James Wilson then proposed having electors select the president instead. As the convention progressed, a committee dedicated to ironing out the specifics suggested that the president be elected by electors, whose numbers would mirror each state's congressional representation. This was a blend of the Connecticut Compromise and the 3/5 Compromise's outcomes. Gouverneur Morris, a member of this committee, pointed out that selecting the president through electors would avoid the potential for conspiracy that might arise if the president were chosen by Congress or a small group that met frequently. Several founding fathers, including Mason, Butler, Morris, Wilson, and Madison, acknowledged that the Electoral College could safeguard the election process against corruption and factionalism. However, figures like Wilson and Madison were ideally in favor of a direct vote by the people. Madison noted the challenge of achieving consensus on a direct vote due to the significant differences in voting rights between the North and the South, particularly regarding the South's inability to count slaves in elections. The Electoral College proposal, with slight adjustments, was eventually passed on September 4, 1787. States with smaller populations or size, like Connecticut, New Jersey, and Maryland, generally supported the Electoral College, thinking it would level the playing field. They believed that in case of no clear winner, the House of Representatives would play a decisive role, with each state having one vote, a situation small states felt could work in their favor. James Madison, in the Federalist Papers, especially in Federalist No. 39, discussed the Constitution's approach to electing a president. He saw it as a blend of state-based and population-based governance, capturing the essence of both in the structure of Congress, 2 houses, one representing states equally and the other based on population, and in the mixed approach of the Electoral College for presidential elections. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist No. 68, published on March 12, 1788, detailed the benefits of the Electoral College system. He emphasized that electors are selected by the people, solely for this purpose and only temporarily, to prevent the influence of party-controlled legislatures or foreign powers. The process occurs across all states, ensuring no single state's corruption could influence the overall election outcome. Hamilton valued majority rule in the Electoral College as essential for a Republican government, and pointed out that gathering in state capitals meant electors could access information not widely available to the public. Also, by excluding federal office holders from being electors, it ensured no elector would have a conflict of interest regarding presidential candidates. Hamilton also appreciated that the Electoral College would make its decision calmly and broadly, without the risk of violence or intimidation that could occur if the decision were made in a single location. Should the Electoral College fail to find a clear majority, the House of Representatives would select the president from the top 5 candidates, prioritizing competence and character. Hamilton voiced concerns over the potential election of individuals skilled in deceit or populism over truly qualified leaders. In Federalist No. 10, James Madison discussed the dangers of factions or groups of citizens with opposed interests or passions to the rights of others and the community at large. He argued that a representative democracy, bolstered by federalism, separation of powers, and distribution of voter rights, would protect against the risks posed by factions. Madison believed that the larger and more diverse the republic, the harder it would be for factions to gain traction due to challenges such as regional differences. The United States Constitution doesn't specifically mention the Electoral College, but this term has been used since the early 19th century to describe the collective group of electors who vote for president and vice president. The term was formally recognized in federal law in 1845 and is currently found in Title III, United States Code, Section 4, both in the section heading and within the text, referred to as College of Electors. The Constitution's Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3, laid out the initial method for selecting a president through electors. Initially, these electors each had 2 votes for president, without a separate vote for vice president. The top vote-getter would become president, and the runner-up would become vice president. Stanley Chang highlighted that the Founding Fathers intended for the election of the president to mirror the public's opinion at the time, free from the influence of specific factions or foreign powers. They desired a process that would decisively reflect the public's will while minimizing chaos and disorder. Electors were meant to be chosen by the people in voting districts, ensuring a broad electorate for selecting these critical positions. Furthermore, these electors were expected to think independently, bringing their best judgment to the choice of president without predetermined pairs of candidates for president and vice president. William C. Kimberling likened the role of these electors in choosing the president to the College of Cardinals selecting the Pope, emphasizing the selection based on merit rather than political affiliation or state origin. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson expressed that the original vision allowed electors to vote their conscience, unswayed by external pressures or commitments to specific individuals. Justice Jackson supported his argument by referring to Federalist No. 68, which advocated for a system where the electors chosen specifically for this task would make the decision. This system aimed to ensure that those making the decision would be well-informed and able to engage in thoughtful deliberation. Philip J. Van Fossen from Purdue University mentioned that the electoral system was not primarily about reflecting the direct will of the people but acting as a safeguard against being misled. Randall Calvert from Washington University in St. Louis indicated that the framers valued the judgment of knowledgeable electors over the direct choice of the populace. Michael Siner explained that the Electoral College was designed as a means to ensure that leaders who are thoughtful and considerate could have the final say on the popular vote if necessary, to safeguard constitutional values. Similarly, Robert Schlesinger from U.S. News and World Report suggested that the Electoral College was meant to act as a check on the decisions of an uninformed electorate. Despite Alexander Hamilton's belief that electors should be chosen through a widespread vote, initially, most states had their electors selected by state legislatures. Over time, states gradually moved to a system where electors were chosen by the people's vote. By 1824, there were still 6 states where electors were appointed by legislatures. By 1832, South Carolina was the only state that hadn't made the switch. Since 1864, with the exception of Colorado in 1876 due to logistical challenges, electors in every state have been selected through a popular vote on Election Day. This means that the president and vice president are essentially chosen indirectly by the citizens. When the United States Constitution was written, its authors didn't really expect the rise of political parties, a sentiment echoed strongly in George Washington's farewell address in 1796, where he warned against forming them. Nor did they foresee the concept of candidates campaigning for the presidency. However, not long after the Constitution came into effect, political parties and election campaigns quickly became a fixed part of the American political scene. By the time of the 1796 election, these developments started to complicate things. That year, John Adams from the Federalist Party won the presidency, but Thomas Jefferson, his main rival from the Democratic-Republican Party, ended up as vice president because he came in second. Imagine that. The president and vice president were from opposing political parties. The 1800 election saw things getting even more complicated. The Democratic-Republican Party nominated Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr for vice president again. After the electoral votes were counted, both Jefferson and Burr found themselves in a tie with 73 votes each. Since the original system didn't differentiate between the votes for president and vice president, every vote for Burr was also a vote for him to be president, even though he was meant to be Jefferson's running mate. With no outright winner, the decision went to the House of Representatives as per the constitutional backup plan. In a rather strategic move by the outgoing Federalists in the House, they tried to throw the election Burr's way to upset Jefferson and his party. After an intense struggle that lasted for 35 ballots without a clear winner, James A. Bayard of Delaware, along with some Federalists from South Carolina, Maryland, and Vermont, decided to abstain from voting, finally tipping the scales in Jefferson's favor on the 36th ballot. To address the chaos witnessed in these elections, Congress put forward the 12th Amendment on December 9, 1803, which was ratified by June 15, 1804. This amendment changed the rules by requiring electors to cast separate votes for president and vice president, starting with the election of 1804. This aimed to prevent the confusion and deadlock of previous elections by making the electoral process clearer and more systematic. Some of the people who helped build the foundations of the United States, known as the Founding Fathers, had initially hoped that each person who helps choose the president, called an elector, would be selected by the citizens of their area. They imagined these electors would have the freedom to think deeply and decide who would make the best president. In a famous document called Federalist No. 68, Alexander Hamilton shares this vision, explaining that a small, well-informed group chosen by the people would have the necessary skills and knowledge for such a complex decision. Hamilton emphasized that the process was designed to ensure these electors were unbiased and not influenced by any promises or obligations to vote a certain way. This was meant to keep the process of choosing a president free from corruption and bias, ensuring that electors would make their decision based on sound judgment and not external pressures. However, over time, the reality has strayed from this original idea. Electors began to pledge their votes to specific candidates in advance, making them less independent thinkers and more like party followers, lacking in critical thought. Justice Robert H. Jackson even called them voluntary party lackeys and intellectual non-entities. Hamilton had hoped for electors who would carefully evaluate candidates and choose the best one through deliberate consideration, a sentiment echoed by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2020 when it cited John Jay's expectations for electors' discretion and judgment. Reflecting on how the process has evolved, a U.S. Senate report in 1826 and Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story in 1833 pointed out the disappointment in how the electors had become far from the independent and discerning body originally envisioned. Despite being intended as a group that would make their selection free from external influence, it became well known that electors did not fulfill this role. Instead, they often pledged their votes according to the wishes of others, acting more as agents than the autonomous decision-makers they were meant to be. Justice Story noted that the system had moved so far from what the framers intended, that acting as an independent elector, as originally envisioned, would be seen as dishonorable or even deceitful. This marked a significant departure from the early designs of the Electoral College process, highlighting a shift from independence to pledged loyalty that underscored a profound transformation in how presidents are chosen. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution outlines how each state is to select a group of electors. The total number of these electors equals the state's total number of senators and representatives in Congress. However, current senators, representatives, or individuals holding a significant position of trust or profit under the United States cannot serve as electors. Originally, influential figures such as Alexander Hamilton and James Madison believed electors would be chosen in distinct districts within each state. The last time this district-based selection occurred was in Michigan in 1892. For instance, back in Massachusetts in 1820, voters directly chose their electors on the ballot, without specifically voting for a presidential candidate. However, as times changed, some states began to adopt a general ticket system, where all of the state's electors would pledge their votes to the same presidential candidate, essentially the choice of the party. This tactic emerged because states realized if all their electors voted uniformly, they could exert a stronger influence on the presidential election. Once a few states started using this strategy, others felt pressured to do the same to maintain their political power. When Hamilton and Madison noticed this shift towards a unified state vote, or the general ticket system, they were not happy. They had envisioned a system where electors would be selected by their local district, believing this method was implied at the Constitution's creation. They argued so passionately against the general ticket system that they sought to amend the Constitution to enforce the district selection method. Unfortunately, Hamilton's early death after a duel with Aaron Burr put an end to his activism, and Madison, despite his efforts, also recognized the growing challenge of amending the Constitution, especially as the number of states increased. Despite the founders' intent for electors to be chosen through a more direct form of democracy, by the people and for the areas they represented, The Constitution never explicitly mandated states to adopt any particular method of electoral selection. The early suggestions that electors be selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass, as outlined in Federalist No. 68, and the push for an immediate act of the people's will, indicates a preference for a more inclusive selection process. Yet, as history shows, the evolution of the electoral system responded to strategic political pressures rather than the original intent of its framers, leading to the widespread adoption of the general ticket system, despite Hamilton, Madison, and even Jefferson advocating for the district plan as a more representative method of elector selection. Back in 1789, Pennsylvania and Maryland started using the winner-take-all approach, which means the candidate with the most votes in the whole state took all the electoral votes from that state. Meanwhile, Massachusetts, Virginia, and Delaware decided their electoral votes based on who won in each district. In 5 other states, Connecticut, Georgia, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and South Carolina, the state legislatures picked their electors without a public vote. New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island didn't take part in the election that year. New York was stuck in a deadlock and didn't vote, while North Carolina and Rhode Island hadn't approved the Constitution yet. By the year 1800, some changes happened. Virginia and Rhode Island started voting at large, meaning the total state vote determined their electors. Kentucky, Maryland, and North Carolina, on the other hand, chose to elect their representatives by district popular votes. At this time, 11 states left the decision to their state legislatures. The trend towards using the winner-take-all system based on the statewide vote really kicked off after 1804. By 1832, South Carolina was the only state still letting its legislature pick its electors, a practice it stopped after 1860. Maryland stood out because it was the only one using a district plan, and district plans pretty much disappeared until the 20th century, except for Michigan in 1892. Over time, 10 states from various regions have tried using the district method. Since 1836, almost every state has stuck with the winner-take-all method, where the statewide popular vote decides all the state's electoral votes. Today, only Maine since 1972 and Nebraska since 1992 are doing things differently. They use a district system, but they also have 2 electors who go with the statewide vote winner. Ever since the mid-1800s, when the system changed to allow voters directly to pick all electors, the Electoral College has generally backed the presidential candidate who got the most votes across the country. However, there are notable exceptions to this trend in the elections of 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016, when the Electoral College selected a candidate who did not lead in the national vote tally. Some argue that the 1960 election also fits this category. It's a bit tricky to gauge the situation back in 1824, though, as 6 states didn't have people vote for electors. Instead, these electors were chosen by state legislatures. Since no candidate secured enough electoral votes that year, the election result was determined by a vote in the House of Representatives, making it a unique case. When the United States Constitution was first drafted, it included a plan for how congressional seats and electoral college votes would be distributed based on population, as counted in a census every 10 years. This setup included the controversial decision to count each slave as 3/5 of a person for these purposes. Despite the fact that slaves couldn't vote, this rule gave slave states more influence in electing presidents, although the slaves themselves had no voice. At the start, the numbers seemed to favor states in the North, which were moving away from slavery, over the slaveholding states in the South. But due to various factors, including states that didn't participate in the first election, the North's lead was smaller than expected. Over the next 20 years, the 3/5 rule meant that Southern states had fewer electoral college votes than the North, even though the rule was meant to boost their influence. Interestingly, historians have found that this 3/5 compromise didn't drastically change the balance of power between the North and South or within the political parties of the time. For instance, it only slightly benefited the Jefferson Republicans in the early years and had a minimal effect during the so-called Second Party system with the rise of the Jacksonians. There are a few key moments in U.S. presidential elections where the 3/5 rule played a role. It impacted the outcome of several elections between 1792 and 1860, including helping Thomas Jefferson win in 1800, according to historian Gary Wills. However, another historian, Sean Wilentz, disputes the idea that the Electoral College was specifically designed to support slavery, noting that electoral tactics used against Jefferson are often overlooked. Legal scholar Akil Reed Amar points out that the 3/5 rule was a win for Virginia, which gained a significant number of votes, and highlights how this rule offered more protection for slavery. Despite this, the Electoral College has had its defenders, who argue it has served purposes beyond just protecting slave states. Abraham Lincoln, for instance, won the presidency through the Electoral College, even with just a plurality of the popular vote, a win some say validates the system beyond its original context. Critics of replacing the Electoral College with a national popular vote include notable figures from both slaveholding and free states, suggesting that concerns about such a move spanned different issues, including fears of corruption and the loss of state influence. Ultimately, the 3/5 rule and its impact on early U.S. presidential elections underscore the complex interplay between slavery, electoral politics, and the balance of power among states. The 14th Amendment, Section 2 sets up a rule. If a state stops any man who is 21 or older from voting, unless it's because he has committed a crime or participated in a rebellion, that state will lose some of its seats in the House of Representatives. The number of seats a state loses matches up with the number of people it stops from voting. This part of the amendment specifically mentions that this rule applies to elections where people vote for who will become President and Vice President of the United States, highlighting that it is the only section in the Constitution that points to electors being chosen by what we call the popular vote. Back on May 8, 1866, Thaddeus Stevens, who was leading the Republicans in the House at the time, talked about how critical he thought this section was. In a debate about the 14th Amendment, he made his point clear about Section 2. He argued that it was all about setting the ground rules for how many representatives each state could have in Congress. If a state decided to take away the voting rights of its adult male citizens, then it would also lose its right to have a proportional representation in Congress. Thaddeus Stevens believed that this rule could push states toward allowing every man to vote. If they didn't, they'd risk losing their influence in the national government, which includes both legislative and executive branches. To make sure this part of the amendment works, there is a federal law outlined in 2 United States Code, Section 6, that puts the mandate into action. Under the U.S. Constitution, specifically Article 2, Section 1, Clauses 3 and 4, along with the 12th Amendment, Congress has the power to set a uniform voting day for electors in the Electoral College. Essentially, electors from all states must cast their votes on the same day. Plus, it is mandated that the President of the Senate, in view of both the Senate and the House of Representatives, must open all the electoral vote certificates, and then those votes are officially counted. Back in 1887, motivated by a controversial presidential election just a decade prior in 1876, where there was more than one set of electors presented by several states, Congress enacted the Electoral Count Act. This piece of legislation, now a part of the U.S. Code, Title III, Chapter 1, detailed the process for counting electoral votes and set deadlines for states regarding elector selection, dispute resolution, and the casting of electoral votes. From the year 1948 up to 2022, Electoral College meetings were scheduled for the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, following the elector's appointment. However, this timing was altered by the Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Improvement Act of 2022, which set the meeting for the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday in December, subsequent to their appointment. Furthermore, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 bars any federal officials, whether elected or appointed, from serving as electors. The responsibility of managing the Electoral College falls to the Office of the Federal Register. After the electors vote, every state forwards a certified record of its electoral vote to Congress. This record is known as the Certificate of Vote. These certificates are then opened and read aloud during a joint session of Congress, typically held on January 6th, unless a different date is legally established. The reading is carried out by the sitting Vice President, who acts as the President of the Senate. If a candidate receives a majority of the electoral votes, they are declared the winner. In cases where there's a tie or no candidate secures a majority for the presidency or vice presidency, the decision moves to Congress through a process known as a contingent election. Even though we add up everyone's vote across the country to get what's called the national popular vote, it is not directly how we choose the president and vice president. Instead, we have something called the Electoral College, a group of 538 electors from all the states and Washington, D.C. These electors are picked based on each state's rules and usually all go to the winner of that state's vote. Since the election in 1824, most states give all their electors to whichever presidential candidate wins the most votes in the state on Election Day. However, as of 2020, Maine and Nebraska do things a bit differently by dividing their electors according to who wins in each congressional district, a method Maine has used since 1972 and Nebraska since 1992. When you vote for president and vice president, you are actually voting for a group of electors pledged to support those candidates. These electors are supposed to vote for the candidates they promise to support, but occasionally some do not. We call these faithless electors. To win the presidency or vice presidency, a candidate needs to get more than half of the electoral votes, which is at least 270 right now. But if no one gets a majority, there is a backup plan in the Constitution's 12th Amendment. In that case, the House of Representatives picks the president from the top 3 candidates, and the Senate picks the vice president from the top 2. In the United States, the total number of electors that each state receives for the Electoral College equals the sum of its number of senators, which is always 2, plus its number of representatives in Congress. The number of representatives is at least 1 per state and otherwise depends on the state's population, reassessed every 10 years through the national census. To break it down, 153 of the electors are evenly distributed among all the states and the District of Columbia, giving them 3 each, while the remaining 385 electors are allocated according to each state's population size. Thanks to the 23rd Amendment, Washington, D.C. receives as many electors as it would if it were a state, but it cannot have more than the least populous state. Based on the 2020 census, this is Wyoming with 3 electors. Thus, D.C. also receives 3 electors. Despite not being a state and its right to only 3 electors due to its population, D.C. ranks 3rd for having the most Electoral College votes per person, right after Wyoming and Vermont. Currently, there are a total of 538 electors. This figure is made up of 435 representatives and 100 senators from the 50 states, plus an additional 3 electors given to Washington, D.C. The states with the highest number of electors are California with 54, Texas with 40, Florida with 30, New York with 28, Illinois and Pennsylvania each with 19. The District of Columbia, along with the 6 smallest states by population, Alaska, Delaware, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming, each have 3 electors. The practice of recognized political parties selecting a group of potential electors is a tradition that started quite early on. Nowadays, for every pair of presidential and vice presidential candidates, there is a specific group of potential electors tied to them. So when people vote for a president and vice president on Election Day, they are actually choosing the electors linked to that pair of candidates. The way these elector candidates are chosen differs from state to state and happens in the months leading up to Election Day. In some states, voters select these electors in primaries, just like they do for presidential candidates. Meanwhile, states like Oklahoma, Virginia, and North Carolina have their electors chosen at party conventions. Over in Pennsylvania, the candidate's campaign team selects their electors, and this method is aimed at preventing faithless electors, those who do not vote as promised. Depending on the state, electors can also be chosen by the state legislatures or directly appointed by their parties. According to Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, it is up to the state legislatures to decide how each state's electors are selected. However, it also sets a rule that prohibits anyone who is holding an office of trust or profit in the U.S. from being an elector. Additionally, the 14th Amendment's Section 3 states that anyone who is sworn to uphold the U.S. Constitution to hold a state or federal office and then acts against the United States, either directly or by aiding its enemies, cannot be an elector either. Congress does have the power to override this prohibition with a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. Nowadays, all states use the popular vote to choose their presidential electors. As of 2020, 8 states even list these electors by name on the ballot. However, most states use what's called a short ballot, which just shows the names of the presidential and vice presidential candidates, not the electors themselves. Some states allow for write-in candidates, but often they ask these candidates to register in advance and name their electors then. Since 1992, nearly every state has adopted a winner-takes-all approach for allocating electors, meaning all electors on the slate for the winning ticket of the state's popular vote are chosen as presidential electors. Maine and Nebraska are the exceptions, choosing instead to distribute their electors based on the popular vote within each congressional district. In these states, one elector goes to the winner in each district, and the state's remaining 2 electors go to the statewide vote winner. Maine has been doing this since 1972, and Nebraska since 1992. The Supreme Court has confirmed that states have the full right to decide how their electors are chosen in a case called McPherson v. Blacker in 1892. Election Day is set for the Tuesday following the first Monday in November. After the votes are in, each state prepares 7 certificates of ascertainment. These documents list the presidential and vice presidential candidates, their pledged electors, and the total votes received. These certificates, carrying the state seal and the governor's signature, or the mayor of D.C.S., are then sent to the National Archivist in Washington as soon as possible after Election Day. The process of the Electoral College is unique in that it does not convene in a single location. Instead, electors gather in their state capitals, or for those from the District of Columbia within the district, on a specific day determined by Congress. This day falls on the Tuesday after the second Wednesday in December. During these meetings, electors cast their votes for president and vice president on separate ballots. Even though the steps electors follow can differ slightly from state to state, there is a general procedure they tend to adhere to, a procedure Congress has the constitutional power to oversee. The meeting begins with an election certification official, often the state's Secretary of State or an equivalent figure, who reads the certificate of ascertainment. This document confirms the appointees who will cast the electoral votes. Attendees are then checked off and any missing electors are recorded. A president or chairman for the meeting is selected, occasionally alongside a vice chairman, and sometimes a secretary is chosen to document the meeting's minutes. This secretary might not be an elector. It is common for political officials to make brief speeches at this point. When it is time to vote, 1 or 2 individuals are appointed as tellers. In some states, a candidate is nominated to receive the electoral votes, typically the candidate of the elector's political party. Each elector submits a written vote for a presidential candidate. The method of voting varies by state. For instance, New Jersey uses pre-printed cards with candidates' names to check off, while North Carolina electors write the candidate's name on a blank card. Tellers count these votes and declare the results. Voting for the vice president is conducted in a similar manner afterward. According to the Electoral Count Act, updated and outlined in 3 United States Code Section 9, each group of state electors must create 6 certificates of vote. Each of these must be signed by all electors and include a certificate of ascertainment. Each certificate lists the names of candidates who received electoral votes for president or vice president. These certificates are then dispatched in a specific manner: 1 to the President of the Senate, 2 to the Archivist of the United States, 2 to the State Secretary of State, and 1 to the Chief Judge of the Federal District Court where the electors convened. A staff member from the Senate President's office, typically the sitting Vice President, gathers these certificates and prepares them for a joint congressional session. They are stored unopened in 2 special mahogany boxes, sorted alphabetically. 1 box for Alabama through Missouri, including the District of Columbia, and another for Montana through Wyoming. Before 1950, this certification process was managed by the Secretary of State's office. Since then, the Office of the Federal Register within the Archivist's office takes on this role, ensuring the documents meet all formal requirements and correcting any discrepancies. This process ensures that the electoral votes are accurately recorded and verified. In the United States electoral system, electors are the individuals who cast the official votes for the president and vice president. There is an interesting rule, though. Each elector must ensure that at least one of their votes for either president or vice president goes to someone who is not from their own state. Sometimes you hear about faithless electors. These are electors who do not vote for the candidate they promise to support. Although this does not happen often because electors are typically loyal party members dedicated to their candidate. After the 2016 election, where 10 electors did not follow through on their pledges, 33 states plus the District of Columbia started enforcing laws against such faithless voting. Faithless electors have not ever swayed the result of a presidential election. Since the inception of the Electoral College, out of 23,529 electors up to 2016, just 165 have broken their pledge. Notably, 71 of these instances were due to the candidate passing away before the electors voted. There have, however, been a couple of instances where vice presidential outcomes were influenced by faithless electors. For instance, in 1796, 18 electors did not cast their second vote for John Adams' running mate, leading to Thomas Jefferson becoming vice president instead. Similarly, in 1836, faithless electors from Virginia did not support Richard Mentor Johnson, leading to a Senate decision to elect the vice president. Despite debates over whether states can regulate how electors vote, the United States Supreme Court has upheld that state restrictions are indeed constitutional. The court's decisions in Ray v. Blair in 1952 and Chiafalo v. Washington in 2020 supported states' rights to require electors to follow through with their pledges. Electors who go against their pledge might not only face legal consequences, but could also be censured by their political parties, given that loyalty to the party is usually why they are chosen in the first place. Under the 12th Amendment, Congress meets in a combined session to officially count the electoral votes and announce the election winners. This session typically happens on January 6th, following the year the electors meet. Thanks to the 20th Amendment, it is the job of the new Congress to declare who won the presidency and vice presidency, whereas before 1936, this was done by the outgoing House. The Office of the Federal Register oversees the Electoral College process. The count is scheduled for 1 p.m. in the United States House of Representatives chamber, with the vice president expected to lead the meeting. However, there have been times when the Senate's president pro tempore has taken charge. During these sessions, the vice president and the House Speaker take their places at the podium, with the vice president to the Speaker's right. 2 mahogany boxes, containing the certified votes from each state, are brought in by Senate pages and placed in front of the attendees. Both the Senate and the House select 2 tellers to count these votes, usually one from each political party, and they read out important parts of each state's vote certificate in alphabetical order. Before a change in the law in 2022, any member of Congress could challenge a state's vote if they had at least one other member from both the Senate and the House to back them up in writing. After the amendment, the rule now requires the backing of 1/5 of each House to make an objection. If there is a valid objection, the joint session pauses for each House to debate and vote separately on the issue. For a state's vote to be discarded, both houses must agree by a simple majority. The same goes for individual votes. If there are no objections, or if any objections are dismissed, the presiding officer includes that state's votes in the official count as per the vote certificate. Once all certificates are accounted for and votes tallied, the presiding officer announces the election results. This marks the end of the session and officially recognizes the elected president and vice president. The senators then leave the House chamber, and the final vote count is recorded in the journals of both the Senate and the House. Raising objections to the electoral vote count doesn't happen often, but there have been a few notable instances. Back in 1864, during the thick of the American Civil War, the votes from Louisiana and Tennessee were completely dismissed. In 1872, Arkansas and Louisiana's votes were thrown out again, along with 3 of Georgia's 11 electoral votes. This was because of claims of electoral fraud, and because the votes were for a candidate who had passed away. Then following the contentious 1876 election, where there was confusion over which electoral votes to count due to claims of 2 separate state governments in a few states, Congress stepped in. They established the Electoral Count Act, aiming to make the objection process more straightforward. Fast forward to the 2000 presidential election, which was a nail-biter between Governor George W. Bush and Vice President Al Gore. The election's conclusion was ultimately determined by the Supreme Court in the Bush versus Gore case. During the electoral vote count in 2001, despite the presence of objections that would have favored him, Vice President Al Gore, who was presiding over the count, had to deny these objections because no senators supported them. In the 2004 election, there were allegations of voter suppression and machine issues in Ohio. This time, both a representative and a senator objected, triggering a pause in the joint session as required by the Electoral Count Act. However, Congress swiftly dismissed these objections. During the 2016 election count, 11 objections came up from various Democratic representatives. Yet, without any senator's endorsement, Vice President Joe Biden had to block all of these attempts. The 2020 election saw its share of drama with 2 objections and a violent interruption at the U.S. Capitol by supporters of outgoing President Donald Trump. Objections regarding the votes from Arizona and Pennsylvania went ahead since they were supported by both a House member and a senator, leading to debates that ultimately ended in rejection. Additional objections to votes from Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Wisconsin were also raised but didn't progress due to the lack of senatorial support. Let's talk about what happens if no presidential candidate wins a clear majority of the electoral votes, which since 1964 means at least 270 out of the 538 available votes. When this occurs, the 12th Amendment steps in and directs the House of Representatives to immediately start the process of selecting the president. But there's a catch. The House can only choose from the top 3 candidates in terms of electoral votes. Each state delegation in the House gets only 1 vote to cast. And importantly, the District of Columbia doesn't get a say in this. For a candidate to be declared the winner and become the president-elect, they must win the majority of the votes from the state delegations. Since the last state joined in 1959, that magic number stands at 26 out of the 50 states. Voting can only happen if 2/3 of the states are represented, and the House keeps voting until a president is elected. Interestingly, this unique method of selecting a president has only been needed twice in American history, once in 1801, under the original rules of the Constitution, and again in 1825, this time under the guidance of the 12th Amendment. When it comes time to pick a vice president and no candidate has won more than half of the electoral votes, the Senate steps in to make the choice. They can only pick from the top 2 candidates who received the most electoral votes. Usually this means choosing between 2 individuals. But sometimes, if there's a tie for second place, more than 2 candidates could be under consideration. Senators vote individually, not as state groups, and at least 2/3 of them need to be present to vote. According to the 12th Amendment, a candidate needs to receive votes from more than half of all senators to win, which right now means at least 51 out of 100. This rule also means that the vice president, who usually has the power to break ties in the Senate, cannot do that in this election. Despite some debate among experts and reporters, the rule is clear that the vice president cannot break a tie in this situation. The only time the Senate had to pick the vice president was back in 1837. They did it by calling out names in alphabetical order and having senators vote out loud. They had decided beforehand that if Richard M. Johnson or Francis Granger received more than half the votes from senators, the Senate's leader would announce that person as the duly elected vice president of the United States. In the end, they chose Johnson. Section 3 of the 20th Amendment outlines what happens if by noon Eastern Standard Time on January 20th, the House of Representatives hasn't chosen a president-elect yet. In such cases, the vice president-elect steps in as acting president until the House makes a decision. Additionally, Section 3 gives Congress the power to decide who should act as president if both a president-elect and a vice president-elect are missing when Inauguration Day rolls around. According to the Presidential Succession Act from 1947, in that scenario, the Speaker of the House would take over as acting president until either the president or the vice president is selected by the House or Senate, respectively. Interestingly, we've never found ourselves in either of these situations. In Federalist No. 68, Alexander Hamilton expressed a concern that led to the establishment of the Electoral College. He highlighted the necessity of ensuring smooth transitions of power and maintaining government continuity during the changeover from one presidency to another. Fast forward to 2020 in the Chiafalo v. Washington case. The United States Supreme Court clarified, despite it not being the main issue of the case, that states are not permitted to force electors to vote for candidates who have passed away. This statement came after the court reflected on the historical event of 1872, when Horace Greeley, who was running for president, died after Election Day, but before the Electoral College convened. This resulted in more than 1/3 of all faithless electoral votes in United States history being cast, leading to concerns about what happens if a candidate dies in this critical period. In the 1872 election, Greeley won the popular vote in 6 states and was entitled to 66 electoral votes. After his death, 63 electors did not vote as pledged, and 3 electoral votes from Georgia meant for Greeley were invalidated because he had passed away. Interestingly, Greeley's vice presidential running mate, B. Gratz Brown, still received 47 electoral votes, including the 3 from Georgia that were not counted for Greeley. Presidential transitions have historically been periods of heightened security concerns. For example, after his election in 1860, Abraham Lincoln had to travel to Washington, D.C. incognito due to threats on his life. Similarly, an assassination attempt on Herbert Hoover was thwarted in 1928 after a plot by an Argentine anarchist group was discovered. In 1932, during Franklin D. Roosevelt's transition, an assassination attempt on him resulted in the death of Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak and injuries to others when Giuseppe Zangara opened fire. Richard Paul Pavlik planned to assassinate John F. Kennedy in 1960 using a car loaded with explosives, but his plan was foiled and he was detained. During the transition following the 2008 election, Barack Obama was the target of plotting, though these threats were neutralized. Most notably in 2020, the transition was marked by controversy as Donald Trump disputed the election results, leading to a delay in the formal start of the transition process. This culminated in an attack on the United States Capitol on January 6, an effort to disrupt the certification of Joe Biden's victory, which ultimately was unsuccessful. In 1933, a part of the 20th Amendment was put in place stating, if the person elected as president dies before they can start their job, the vice president-elect will take over as president. Akhil Amar has pointed out a bit of confusion in the amendment, essentially saying it's not clear exactly when the winning candidates officially receive their titles of president-elect and vice president-elect. This is because the wording in Article 2, Section 1 and the 12th Amendment seems to suggest that this official status does not happen until the Electoral College votes are counted. However, a 2020 study by the Congressional Research Service says that most experts think the winning team is officially in their roles as soon as they secure the majority of electoral votes, based on a report from a House committee back in 1932. There is also information on what happens if there is a sudden vacancy on a presidential ticket, either before or after the election, but before the Electoral College meets. For example, back in 1912, the Republican candidate for vice president, James S. Sherman, passed away just before the election, and Nicholas Murray Butler had to step in. Similarly, in 1972, Democratic Vice President nominee Thomas Eagleton withdrew after the Democratic National Convention, and Sargent Shriver replaced him. In these cases, it's up to the political party's rules to handle such changes. But if the vacancy happens between the election and when the Electoral College meets, like what happened in 1872, when Horace Greeley passed away and wasn't replaced, most legal experts believe that political parties can still use their rules to fill the vacancy. There is a bit of debate whether electors can choose to vote differently in these situations, since they were initially pledged to vote for a specific candidate. The Constitution's Presidential Succession Clause allows Congress to decide who should become president, if both the president and vice president cannot do their jobs. Following this, the first law on this was passed in 1792, requiring a special electoral college election if both the president and vice president were gone. Even though the vice presidency was empty several times between 1792 and 1886, this requirement for a special election was done away with in 1886. President Harry S. Truman, in a message to Congress in the late 1940s, suggested bringing back the idea of special elections if both the president and vice president were unable to serve, but it wasn't included in the 1947 law that was eventually passed. The Continuity of Government Commission has also recommended considering special elections in extreme cases, like a major attack, since all the next-in-line officials for the presidency work in Washington, D.C., which could be risky. According to the 12th Amendment, electors still come together in their states to cast their presidential votes. The CRS also mentioned that anyone stepping in for the president from the succession line, except the vice president, is considered an acting president under current laws, not fully assuming the role of president. Before the short ballot became a thing in the early 1900s, the most common way to elect presidential electors was by using the general ticket system. This system is pretty similar to what we use today, and can be easily mixed up with it. When using the general ticket, voters would choose individual electors directly, but with the short ballot they vote for a whole group of electors at once. Back in the general ticket days, reporting the votes was a bit of a headache, especially in big states like New York where there were a lot of elector positions to fill. Both the general ticket and the short ballot methods are kind of like what we call winner-takes-all voting. The switch to the short ballot happened at different times in different states. For example, North Carolina and Ohio switched in 1932, while Alabama stuck with the general ticket until 1960, making it one of the last states to change. Now, when it comes to how states decide to pick their electors, the U.S. Supreme Court has had a say a couple of times. In a case called McPherson v. Blacker in 1892, the court referred to a part of the Constitution that basically says states can pick their electors however they like. The court's decision emphasized that this clause limits states from restricting legislative power. Then, in a case from 2000 called Bush v. Palm Beach County Canvassing Board, the Supreme Court used the McPherson decision to question a Florida Supreme Court decision, though they didn't outright reverse it. Interestingly, in another case that same year, Bush v. Gore, 3 justices disagreed, saying that the Constitution doesn't let state legislatures ignore their own state's rules. In the early days of presidential elections, it was most common for state legislatures to select the electors, the individuals who would actually vote for the president. This method was widely used in the elections of 1792 and 1800, where the majority of states chose electors in this manner, and it remained quite popular through to 1812 and even into 1824. During the 1824 election, Andrew Jackson actually received the most votes both from the general public and in the Electoral College. But because 6 states didn't allow the public to vote for electors, we can't fully know the popular vote's preference. Some states had their legislatures directly choose the electors, while others used a combination of public vote and legislative choice. By the 1828 election, as democracy became more popular under Jackson, only Delaware and South Carolina were still having their legislatures choose electors. Delaware changed its method by the next election, but South Carolina continued with legislative choice until it left the Union in 1860, not using the popular vote until 1868. After 1832, bypassing South Carolina, the method of legislative appointment occurred only in a few instances. In Massachusetts, in 1848, the legislature had to intervene and choose the electors, giving their votes to the Whigs, because no candidate won a majority in the public vote. Nevada had to resort to legislative choice in 1864 since it joined the Union right before the election. Florida, just back in the Union in 1868, also opted for legislative appointment due to timing. Colorado, newly part of the Union in 1876, chose legislative appointment because of timing and financial constraints. The possibility of a legislature stepping in was even mentioned during the 2000 election. If the Florida recount continued dragging on, the state's legislature was prepared to select the electors to meet the federal deadline. The Constitution permits each state to decide how to pick its electors, and sometimes it's simpler and less expensive for a legislature to do it, rather than setting up an election. However, there are downsides. Legislature debates can be prolonged compared to direct votes from the public. A prime example is New York in 1789, which couldn't reach an agreement and ended up not choosing any electors. Gary Bue's study on discussions within Congress about eliminating the Electoral College highlights a clear divide. Those against change often reference tradition and a preference for voting through representatives, while supporters of change argue for a system where every vote counts equally. Interestingly, the Electoral College system, unique in its implementation, has been abandoned by all other democracies that instead elect their presidents through direct voting. Critics identify several issues with the Electoral College. Firstly, they argue it's not as democratic as simply counting each vote equally, because it allows for the possibility of faithless electors who don't vote according to their pledge. Additionally, the system can result in someone becoming president, even if another candidate received more overall votes from the populace, as occurred in the 2000 and 2016 elections. Furthermore, the voting power of individuals in less populated states is proportionally greater than those in more populated states, leading presidential candidates to potentially focus only on winning a few critical swing states due to this structure. Regarding the opinions of Americans, surveys from the 21st century consistently demonstrate that the majority prefer the concept of electing the president by direct popular vote. However, support for the Electoral College has continually remained within the 35 to 44% range. Opponents argue that the Electoral College does not align with the intended principles of a democratic system, questioning its fairness since it contravenes the one-person, one-vote principle. While some believe that the outcomes under our current Electoral College system would mirror those of a direct vote system, supporters of the Electoral College contend that the two systems would promote different campaign strategies and incentives, suggesting that the results could very well appear significantly different. In a few memorable elections like those in 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016, the person who won through the Electoral College did not actually get the most votes from people across the country. Going a bit further back, the situation in 1824 was even more complex because 6 states chose their electors through the legislature, not by asking people to vote, making it hard to say what the national vote really looked like. Since no candidate received enough electoral votes that year, the House of Representatives had to make the final decision, setting it apart from the other elections we mentioned where voters directly picked electors in all states. The 1960 election also has a bit of a question mark over the true popular vote, especially considering how the votes for Alabama electors are counted. Let's also touch on a few instances where the popular vote did not line up with the Electoral College outcome. In 1800, Jefferson took the presidency with 61.4% of the vote against Adams, who got 38.6%. However, this tally doesn't fully account for how electors were chosen. Fast forward to 1824. And we see Adams winning with just 30.9% of the popular vote, while Jackson had a larger slice at 41.4%, again noting that not all states had a direct vote. The 1836 election had a similar scenario, but only for the vice president position, with Johnson winning 63.5% of the popular vote against Granger's 30.8%. Tilden received 50.9% of the votes in 1876. But it was Hayes who ended up in the White House with 47.9%. In 1888, Cleveland received 48.6% of the vote, but Harrison became president with just 47.8%. The 2000 election saw Gore with 48.4% of the vote, while Bush, who won, had 47.9%. Lastly, in 2016, Clinton got 48.2% of the vote, but Trump won the presidency with 46.1%. These elections illustrate that sometimes the Electoral College results and the nationwide popular vote do not always match up, leading to quite a bit of discussion about the system. The Electoral College system tends to make political campaigners focus intensively on a handful of swing states, essentially sidelining most of the country during election seasons. In these populous swing states, where pre-election polls do not show a clear lead for any candidate, there is a flurry of activity. Candidates make frequent visits. There is a blitz of television advertisements. Party organizers double their efforts to mobilize voters, and debates are more common. In fact, an analysis has found that about 80% of voters on a national scale end up being absolutely ignored. This happens because in most states the electoral votes go entirely to the candidate who wins the most votes in that state, creating a strong pull for candidates to concentrate their efforts on just a few undecided states. In the U.S. electoral system, every state receives at least 3 electoral votes, regardless of its population. This setup tends to give states with smaller populations a disproportionately large amount of power per voter in electing a president. To put it into perspective, the weight of an electoral vote in a highly populated state like California is nearly 4 times less than that of a vote in a sparsely populated state like Wyoming. On average, if you look at the 10 states with the fewest people, their voters have about 2.5 times more electoral influence per person than those in the 10 most populated states. Back in 1968, John F. Banzoff III introduced the Banzoff Power Index, or BPI for short, which presented a compelling case. A New York voter had 3.3 times more influence over the presidential election outcome than an average voter from other states. Following a similar line of reasoning, Mark Livingston analyzed the data from the 1990 census and concluded that voters in the largest state had 3.3 times more power in selecting a president than did voters in Montana. However, not everyone agrees with Banzoff's approach. Some critics argue that his method oversimplifies things by not accounting for the diverse demographic profiles of states and assuming that voting is as random as flipping a coin. They point out that more realistic models, which take into account the actual workings of the Electoral College, consistently show that voters in less populated states end up having their votes count more compared to those in bigger states. In many states, the outcome of elections isn't really swayed by how many people show up to vote, thanks to the strong hold political parties have there. The Electoral College system we use plays a significant role in this, making it so that increasing voter turnout doesn't do much for a party or campaign's chances, unless we're talking about the battleground states where the competition is tight. Now, if we were to select our president through a national popular vote instead, there would be a big push from campaigns and political parties to get people out to vote all across the country. Likewise, everyday individuals would feel more motivated to encourage their friends and neighbors to vote. The way things stand with the Electoral College, there is a noticeable gap in voter participation between the competitive swing states and the rest, indicating that moving to a popular vote system could really enhance how many people take part in elections. Critics of the Electoral College argue that it reduces elections to simply counting electors for each state, thus concealing possible voting issues within those states. For instance, if a state prevents certain groups from voting through methods like reading tests, poll taxes, or legal restrictions targeting specific demographics such as women or people of color, these actions do not affect the state's total electoral count. This means that disenfranchisement has no effect on the state's overall electoral influence, a situation the Electoral College does nothing to address. Furthermore, the Electoral College might lower voter turnout since states have no incentive to increase citizen participation in the voting process, given that their number of electoral votes remains the same. The argument follows that a system based on popular vote would motivate states to involve more people in elections, thus increasing their political influence on a national scale. Critics also believe that the current system protects states from criticism or federal consequences for not allowing subgroups of citizens to vote. Legal experts Akhil Amar and Vikram Amar have highlighted that the Electoral College was originally part of a compromise that allowed southern states to disenfranchise slaves while still maintaining considerable political power by counting them via the 3/5 compromise. According to James Madison, this arrangement was selected because it seemed to be the least objectionable. The Amars also noted that the Electoral College discouraged states from granting women the right to vote, as doing so would not enhance their electoral influence. They observed that after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, southern states gained more electoral power by counting former slaves fully, but then passed laws to limit their voting rights, disproportionately increasing the electoral influence of white votes. Minority voters, often located in states not heavily contested in elections, have a lesser impact compared to white voters who are more likely to live in pivotal swing states. Around 4 million Americans residing in U.S. territories such as Puerto Rico, the Northern Mariana Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and Guam are excluded from voting in presidential elections because only U.S. states and Washington, D.C. have electors. This has led some scholars to argue that the U.S. electoral process does not fully meet democratic standards. Guam tries to bring attention to this issue by conducting non-binding presidential straw polls since the 1980s. Despite this, residents in these territories can take part in party primaries for president. The winner-take-all method adopted by most states diminishes the influence of third parties, making it challenging for them to achieve any electoral relevance. Back in the early days of our country, right up until the 1830s during what's known as the Jacksonian era, a lot of states decided on their electors through votes in their own state legislatures. Some people believe that when it comes down to it, the election of the president really should reflect the decisions made by each state. They argue this keeps the United States true to its federal structure, instead of moving towards a single big central government which could overshadow state powers. In his 2007 book titled A More Perfect Constitution, Professor Larry Sabato suggested tweaking the way we allocate Electoral College votes and Senate seats so they more closely match each state's population. Despite these changes, he still saw the value in keeping the Electoral College, especially for states with smaller populations that can swing elections. He believed this system encourages a stronger bond between states and the overall federal government. Norman R. Williams, a professor from Willamette University College of Law, shared that the creators of the Constitution opted for the Electoral College system for picking the president mostly because of lessons learned during the period after the American Revolution. Before then, state governors were often picked by state legislatures, which showed its own set of problems. The folks at the Constitutional Convention wanted to make sure the new national government had an executive branch that could operate independently from Congress. Alexander Hamilton, one of those founders, thought that the Electoral College would help avoid issues like bias, foreign interference, and domestic plotting in the process of choosing a president. He was particularly keen on not allowing members of Congress or other federal officers to serve as electors, to maintain this independence. Did you know that the United States Electoral College system is the part of the Constitution that people have tried to change the most? That's right. Since the year 1800, there have been more than 700 attempts made in Congress to either reform or get rid of the Electoral College. The folks pushing these changes say it's because the Electoral College doesn't allow for the president to be elected by a direct vote of the people. They also argue that it gives states with smaller populations too much power and can even result in a candidate becoming president without getting the most votes across the country. Despite all these efforts, not a single one has managed to get the necessary two-thirds vote in Congress and the approval of three-fourths of the states needed to change the Constitution. According to experts Ziblatt and Levitsky, the reason none of these efforts have succeeded is that the United States Constitution is incredibly difficult to amend, more so than any other constitution. That's why attempts to reform have always ended up going nowhere in the United States. The most serious effort to get rid of the Electoral College in the United States happened during the 91st Congress, which spanned from 1969 to 1971. This came after the 1968 election, where Richard Nixon defeated Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace, winning the presidency with 301 electoral votes, or 56% of the total, despite only beating Humphrey by a mere 511,944 popular votes, a difference of less than 1%. Emanuel Seller, a Democrat from New York and the head of the House Judiciary Committee, tackled the public's worry about the mismatch between the popular and electoral vote counts. He introduced a proposal for a constitutional amendment. This plan would have scrapped the Electoral College in favor of a system where the presidential and vice presidential candidates who got the most votes nationwide would win, as long as they had at least 40% of the vote. If no one got 40%, a runoff election would decide the winner. On April 29, 1969, the Judiciary Committee approved this idea with a strong 28-6 vote. After lively debates, the full House of Representatives passed it with wide-ranging support, 339-70, on September 18, 1969. Even President Nixon supported the change, urging the Senate to agree on October 30, 1969. It seemed like a strong possibility, especially when the New York Times reported on October 8, 1969, that 30 states looked ready to back the amendment, needing just 38 states in total for it to pass. However, despite its initial success, the plan hit a roadblock in the Senate. The Senate Judiciary Committee recommended its passage by an 11-6 vote in 1970. But when it reached the full Senate, it was filibustered primarily by Southern senators and those from less populous states who feared losing their political clout. Attempts to break the filibuster failed twice, and with the session ending on January 3, 1971, the proposal was shelved and never revisited. On March 22, 1977, President Jimmy Carter reached out to Congress with a significant request. He urged them to consider passing a constitutional amendment that would allow the President of the United States to be elected by a direct vote from the people. In his letter, Carter highlighted a major concern with the current Electoral College system, pointing out that it is entirely possible for a candidate to win the popular vote but still lose the presidency. He referred to historical instances in 1824, 1876, and 1888 as examples, and noted that even in the most recent election, a slight shift in votes in Ohio and Hawaii could have altered the outcome, despite a difference of 1.7 million in the popular vote. Carter emphasized that suggesting a constitutional amendment was not something he took lightly. He believed changes to how the president is elected were crucial, yet he chose not to propose a specific amendment, preferring Congress to explore the topic without his interference. Carter's call for reform of the Electoral College was seen as quite progressive for a president at that time, and exceeded what many were anticipating. The New York Times described Carter's proposal as surprisingly moderate, because it suggested getting rid of the electors while somehow maintaining a version of the electoral voting system. The response from newspapers to Carter's proposal varied, with some editorials expressing support and others, like the one in the Chicago Tribune, criticizing Carter for wanting to dismantle the Electoral College. Adding to the discussion, Representative Jonathan B. Bingham of New York wrote to the New York Times, highlighting the risks associated with the outdated Electoral College. He pointed out that a change of fewer than 10,000 votes in just 2 states could have led to Gerald Ford winning the 1976 election over Jimmy Carter, despite Carter having a lead of 1.7 million votes across the nation. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.